Hey YouTube, today is January 8th, 2021. We're looking at some art world news with a warm cup of coffee and a whole lot of craziness. If you like this kind of content, please like, comment, and subscribe. And with that, let's get moving. Today I'm going to be taking a look at two articles. Today's focus is going to be on the ongoing process of deaccession occurring within museums in the United States, as well as its relationship to ideas about diversity and opportunity. On the screen, I have a response by the board chair of the Everson Museum in New York. We'll take a look at that in a moment. What I want to start with is to read through part of an article in the LA Times by Matt Stromberg, written on December 29th, 2020. The title of the article is How Deaccession Became the Museum Buzzword of 2020. This article has a paywall, so I'm not going to show it, but I have a link in the description below. You're welcome to visit the article in your own time if you'd like. And with that, let's get moving. For the art world, 2020 was the year that the Black Lives Matter movement spurred a deeper conversation about inclusion and equity, ultimately leading some museums to sell off works by certain artists, usually white, often male, ostensibly to diversify their permanent collections. While deaccessioning pieces from collections is not unheard of, museums have historically followed ethical guidelines and invoked the process, usually when art is damaged or decided to be fake, or when it no longer fits their mission. But then the current health crisis came along. Museums came under intense financial pressure as a result of pandemic-related closures. In April, the assistant of the art museum directors approved a resolution specifying it would not censure museums that use funds raised from deaccessioning towards general operating costs or collection care. A string of high-profile auctions followed, as did questions about whether some institutions were using the pandemic as an excuse to sell off works to correct long-running budget woes. The Everson Museum in Syracuse, New York, auctioned Jackson Pollock's 1946 red composition, notable for the abstract expressionist's second foray into the drip technique for which he is best known. Although it was estimated to sell for $18 million, the painting sold to an anonymous buyer for $12 million at an October 6th Christie's auction. In an FAQ posted on the museum's website, the Everson said proceeds from the sale would be used to, quote, establish a fund for acquiring works created by artists of color, women artists, and other underrepresented artists, as well as for the direct care of the museum's collection of more than 10,000 works. Critics lambasted the museum for the decision to part with the historically important work, despite the stated intent. Quote, the goal of diversifying white patriarchal patterns of museum art collecting is hugely important, end quote, wrote Times art critic Christopher Knight. This sort of quick fix belies the seriousness. The end not only doesn't justify the means, these processes do real damage. In response to critics like Knight, the president of the Everson's Board of Trustees wrote an article in the art newspaper, which is what we'll take a look at in a second, defending the sale. We are slowly building a collection relevant to our community, with art that is representative, inspirational, and more current than ever before. An accomplishment to me that is greater than any single piece in the collection, she said. A museum representative told the Times via email that earnings from the fund would not be spent until late 2021. However, recent acquisitions reflect the museum's commitment to expanding the scope of its collection. The list includes works by Sharif Bey, Ellen Blalock, and Ellen L'Esperance, as well as a totemic fabric piece by LA artist Shanique Smith, approved just last week. Quote, we hope the funds will generate approximately $450,000 to $500,000 annually to be split between acquisitions and direct care expenses, but This will need to be approved by our finance committee, the representative said. All right, so I'm going to be skipping through some of this article and reading about two other museums. We're still looking at the same article, but just skipping through some of the middle portion of it. All right, here we go. Perhaps the most controversial deaccession plans this year were tied to the Baltimore Museum of Art, which announced in October that it would sell art valued around $75 million from its collection, anchored by three major works by pop artist Andy Warhol, minimalist Bryce Martin, and abstract expressionist Clifford Still. The Martin and the Still were scheduled for a Sotheby's auction on October 28th, and Warhol's massive 1986 Last Supper canvas was offered through a private sale. The sale was to establish an endowment for the future that would dedicate funds for the care to the collection and allow the museum to expand its ongoing diversity and equity programmatic initiatives by enacting greater structural change within the institution and increasing access for the community. Christopher Knight argued that the BMA, or the Baltimore Museum of Art, was putting the cart before the horse in finding a need and then trolling through its valuable art collection looking for ways to fund it. In the process, he wrote, the museum would thereby stomp all over best practices for deaccessioning art as if no such standards exist. Artists Amy Sherald and Adam Pendleton resigned from the museum board. Two former board chairmen pulled $50 million and promised donations in protest. 24 museum supporters and former trustees wrote an angry letter to the state attorney general and secretary of state asking them to stop the sales. Just 2 hours before it was set to begin, the museum halted the auction, perhaps in response to a, quote, clarification issue by the Museum Directors Association, specifying that its revised deaccessioning policy was not for long-term goals, only for short-term collection care. The BMA released a statement saying, quote, our vision and our goals have not changed. It will take us longer to achieve them, but we will do so through all means at our disposal, end quote. The museum dedicated itself to only collecting work by female-identified artists in 2020. More than half of this year's acquisitions, the museum said, were made possible by a controversial 2018 deaccession of 7 works by Warhol, Rauschenberg, Franz Klein, and others. The most recent deaccession came this month, so in December, in Long Beach, California, where the Museum of Latin American Art tried to auction 59 works from its permanent collection to diversify the artists it showed. Their country of origin, their gender, and the materials with which they were working with were under consideration. A representative of 44 of the 59 works actually sold. All of the 44 works that sold were by male artists, including Mexicans Rafael Coronel and Rodolfo Morales, Brazilian Walter Goldfarb, Cuban Wilfredo Lam, and Chilean Roberto Mata. MOLA chief curator Gabriela Urtiaga told the Times that her bucket list for acquisitions included work by Los Angeles artist Judy Baca, Brazilian painter Tarsila do Amaral, Cuban-American artist Ana Mendieta, Colombian artist Beatriz Gonzalez, and Frida Kahlo. The auction, which generated about $200,000 total, less than the high auction estimate of $474,000, included about 80 pieces donated specifically for museum fundraising, prompting art critic Christopher Knight to suggest that the museum diversify its collection through other means rather than deaccession. Museum collections are strengthened by the addition of important art, he wrote, not by its subtraction. Chief curator Gabriela Urtiaga defended the move, saying that the museum is a living and breathing institution, adapting to its contemporary time. With all of that context, let's take a look at this response in the art newspaper by the board chair of the Everson Museum. So this article is free and open to the public. I'll also have a link to it in the description below if you want to take a look at it for yourself. And with that, let's get moving. This is the, just FYI, this is the painting by Jackson Pollock that was sold. With the amount of content we consume on a daily basis, an image, a story, or even a simple painting has to affect you on an immediate visceral level to leave an indelible mark. We saw an example of this when a photograph of 2-year-old Parker Curry went massively viral as she stood at the National Portrait Gallery entranced with Amy Sherald's portrait of Michelle Obama, the first African American first lady in our nation's history. While she may not have fully grasped what the position of First Lady meant, it was clear that just seeing a larger than life portrayal of a strong, beautiful, and confident woman who looked like her made her jaw drop. As a mother, an art collector, a community member, and simply as a human being, seeing the image of Parker looking up at that portrait moved me on that molecular level we all aspire to experience. Collections like those at the National Portrait Gallery can and should be much more than soulless archives of art, uh, filling storage, filling storage to encyclopedic levels. At their best, our museums are and always have been cultural institutions serving our communities, and to that end carry an obligation to both mirror and support the advance of the communities they serve and benefit. These are hardly unrealistic or overly grand aspirations for the Everson Museum of Art in Syracuse, New York, where I currently serve as president of the Board of Trustees. As the second woman to hold this seat in over 50 years and the youngest in its history, I embrace the responsibility of furthering this institution's mission for cultural progress. Deaccessioning Jackson Pollock's red composition, 1946, at the Christie's auction on October 6th was just one more measure of that progress. As a trustee, I'm a volunteer, and like most who volunteer on boards at smaller, medium sized regional art museums, I'm here because I believe in art and want to serve my community by making the museum as relevant, viable, and accessible to all as possible. Since establishing a collecting priorities plan in 2017, the Everson has used limited acquisition funds to focus on adding works by artists of color, women, and other underrepresented artists. Our actions in recent years more than back this up. Our collection now includes works by all of these people whose names I'm not going to read because I know I'm going to mess up their names, but we're moving on. The sale of the Pollock, which brought $12 million, will enable the Everson to significantly intensify our strategic efforts, particularly during this critical time in our nation's history. We are actively focused on working to address inequality both within the institution itself and the community it represents. While fine arts experts and critics may try to shame the Everson and other like minded museums for the decision to Deaccession for the purpose of creating an endowment to diversify the collection, these voices are echoing decades of status quo art history textbook and gallery etiquette rather than the realities we are living today. Really? To seek to impose one's ideals of an art museum without considering how significantly the world has changed these last few decades, let alone these past few months. Hindsight's 2020. Considering we're in January now, is nothing short of tone deaf. Even every one of us, especially in the arts, should be acting assuming that we're right in our choices or in our decisions. And what does it mean to be right anyway? The Everson is resolute in its decision to represent our community and will not miss out on an opportunity to create meaningful change. We are slowly building a collection relevant to our community with art that is representative, inspirational, and more current than ever before, an accomplishment to me that is greater than any single piece in the collection. And this goes on a little while more. I'll have this up in the description below if you're interested in reading it on your own. But finally, and I know this is a lot to look at once and to listen to. Along with questions and concerns posed by Matt Stromberg and art critics like Christopher Knight, I have some big questions as well. Here's my biggest question. Equal opportunity and equal outcome are two completely different concepts. And I think actual discussion about these two perspectives is almost completely lacking in art world rhetoric coming out of the United States. Why aren't we talking about these differences and instead shifting towards actual critical thinking and conversations about what diversity and opportunity mean and look like? Instead, it seems like there's a forced initiative by some based on what is expected of people to want diversity to be, onto people who didn't have a choice in how they were born. Superficial and forced diversity is actually extremely discriminatory. It pigeonholes and categorizes people as this or that with strong stereotyped biases as to what is and isn't acceptable at this point in time. Again, no one chose to be born in the bodies they were born in. So is it right to create tokens or stereotypes about people in order to add or subtract from the value of their work? And how do you know what someone's struggles are just because of their sex, gender, race, ethnicity, and so on? None of that is apparent just because of those factors. Why isn't there this much discussion about the ideas of a given work of art instead? It just seems like rather than looking at the broader picture of what diversity, similarity, and difference mean, that many are continuing with tunnel vision and just turning the periscope in a different direction. It's a way of perpetuating the problem, but just looking in a different direction. It's only going to upset more people in the short to medium term, and it's not necessarily an accurate representation of a community either. Second, by subtracting from a collection, how is one actually adding value to it? Subtraction and subsequent addition doesn't necessarily create equivalency. That's a flawed logic in my opinion, because this isn't a math equation. We're talking about culture, heritage, and intellectualism. Finally, by constantly thinking about and obsessing over race, ethnicity, sex, gender, and so on, how does that add value to an art collection, and what is the point of art when it's shaded by the umbrella of overthinking about these aforementioned ideas? Is the point of the collection about the people it was collected from, or is the point about the works themselves? When is the point of an art collection going to be about the art itself? Thanks for listening.